Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for Motivation and Self-Regulation, How Self-Awareness and Observation Can Increase Our Inner Resilience. We're so excited to have you here. My name is Lucy Sullivan. I'm with MRG, and I'm going to be your host today. And before we go ahead and get started, just a little bit of housekeeping to cover. We are recording today's webinar, so you will get a link to the recording and the slides. We also have a blog post where we sum up a lot of the key points, and we also address the Q&A that we didn't get to on the broadcast as well. And since this is a webinar, everyone is on mute, the cameras are off, but we absolutely want to hear from you. So you can put in questions anytime. That Q&A button right at the bottom center of your screen, you're welcome to pop questions in there as they come to you. You don't need to wait for a Q&A break to do that. And we will pass some of those to our presenters during the broadcast, and any that we don't get to, we'll make sure that we follow up to get you those as well. And I'll just tell you briefly then who MRG is, who's going to be guiding you through our content today. So MRG is a global leader in designing assessments that impact people in profound and meaningful ways. We have solutions for leadership, motivation, personal development, sales, service. They're insightful, they're research-backed instruments, and they give action-inspiring feedback to help foster a deep level of self-awareness, which of course is a lot of what we'll be talking about today. MRG's been around for more than 35 years, coming up on 40 now. Our assessments have been used by thousands of certified practitioners in more than 100 countries around the world. We're very proud to be a global company. And we have two presenters today. You get Drew Rand and David Ringwood. So Drew is based in our Portland, Maine office, and he's been with MRG as an IO psychologist for just a couple of years now. And in that time, he's made a very big impact. He's got a breadth of experience in consulting, developing leadership programs. He coaches and works with leaders around the world. Drew has an endless curiosity for assessments. He plays a role in designing and developing them here and refining the ones that you use with MRG. And David is based in our Dublin, Ireland office. He's been with MRG since 2006. He's the VP of Client Development for Europe, Middle East, Africa, sorry. And he has a very extensive consulting background as well. And he really works with our clients in all aspects of the business. He teaches certifications, consulting, product development, and really supports practitioners in any way that they use assessments in their practice. And he's very passionate about assessment and how it can be used to support people in their professional development and in their personal lives as well. And I think we sort of blend that in what you'll be learning here today. So that was a quick intro, but without any more introduction, I will hand things right over to our presenters.
Thank you, Lucy. So you're listening to the voice of David Ringwood. Welcome from a typically rainy day here in Ireland. This is what constitutes the Irish summer. I hope wherever you are, you're keeping well, and we thank you for joining us today. This is a particularly important subject. Self-regulation, our ability to live within this skin of ours, it's one of those inescapable things. I know that one of the inevitable questions is about the current circumstance in which we all find ourselves, that is the COVID scenario. And it is important. Resilience, our ability to manage our external environment, our ability to navigate times such as this, to some extent is a test of our character. But at a different level, it's not. This is not about dealing with tough times or exceptional circumstances. This is about living in the skin of ours. This is about the way that we manage ourselves, and that is never going to go away. So irrespective of circumstances, this matters a great deal. It is a great skill to have in life. It is a great skill to have earlier in life, and the sooner the better. But it's never too late to learn. And I think it's like leadership, it's like parenthood. The day we think we've arrived is the day we're probably making our biggest mistake. So it's worth checking in once in a while. The thing about self-regulation is that there's a real richness and consequently some complexity to it. We have these cycles, which Drew is going to be talking about, which lead us into certain ways of thinking and patterns of emotions and behavioral orientations. And the extent to which we're necessarily aware that we're doing it is one of the biggest considerations here. What we're going to be focusing on here, and Drew will be talking about momentarily, is not necessarily just what we do. It's why we do what we do. what leads us towards certain natural patterns of thoughts and behaviors and emotions. They're not arbitrary. They happen for reasons. So there is the consequence of the external world around us, which in many cases we don't get to make a great deal of choice about. But there is a lot going on within us. And that is something where we have greater potential to influence, to understand, to control if we want to. And that's why we begin by talking about the motivational DNA of the individual. We have ways of measuring that. Some people naturally have strong insights into their motivational patterns, that why they do, what they feel gravitationally pulled towards or not or otherwise. And some people find it very helpful to measure it so that they can take an objective view, a complete view. So this is the point where I'm going to hand it over to Drew, and Drew is going to talk a little bit about that whole motivational dynamic. Drew.
Thank you, David. I appreciate it. It's good to be with you all this morning, this afternoon, this evening, wherever you are in the world. Looking forward to the next hour. First thing that I want to mention here is that David and I will both be referencing MRG's assessment of the Individual Directions Inventory, or the IDI for short. This would be MRG's assessment that really speaks about motivation and talks to us about what is really energizing for an individual. What types of situations do they find emotionally satisfying versus emotionally draining? And in particular relevance here today, the IDI speaks to a person about what their motivational predispositions are, and what does that mean for them, and how can we learn from our predispositions and use that to gain some self-awareness about how our motivations are impacting our thoughts, feelings, behaviors, reactions, and so on. So again, I want to talk about motivation and also motivational predispositions here today, but I want to start with just talking about motivation. There are a few things to bear in mind about motivation that I think are important to recognize. And the first one is that our motivational profile, or motivational factors in our life really originate very early on in our lives. They start to develop very early on, and while they evolve very slowly over time. So things aren't set in stone. Our motivational profile and feelings can change over time, but usually those feelings evolve very slowly over time as we move through life and have life experiences that shape that motivation. And that, I think the other thing that's really important here is that we might be a little bit less in touch with what our motivational profile is, or why it is that we're doing what we're doing, and understanding or being in touch with, these sort of underlying drivers. It's a little bit easier to recognize, your own behavior. It's almost more objective in a way, right? I behaved in this way, and then there was these reactions. It almost feels like there's more of a correlation that you can sort of understand and see. But with motivation, it's sometimes it's a little bit more opaque, and in being in touch with it and understanding what it means for us can be a little bit more difficult. And so when it comes to the IDI, and when I say an IDI score, it really is, an individual's motivation for a particular thing in life. Many people will be surprised by a few of their scores or their motivations, because again, it can be a little bit more difficult to be in touch with it. And you might not have as much self-awareness about what it is that is motivating you. And I think this comes back to the notion that it can be, really difficult to have a truly objective view of yourself. This is not the first time that I will say this, and probably David will say it too. In fact, he probably already has said it. But you are the person who has lived with yourself for X number of years, and because of that, it colors your the view of yourself, and why you do some of the things that you do, or why you don't. And it's hard to pull yourself out of your own image of yourself to have a really objective view of yourself. The other thing here about motivation that is important to understand is that people will have a difficult time, understanding what it means for them when they have a motivation that is extremely strong or extremely weak, right? So, here it's people with extreme scores are likely to underestimate that extremity. And I think this comes down to a few factors. Again, to the point I just made, you've lived with yourself for X number of years and you're the only person who has done that. And because of that, you tend to normalize some of these things. You tend to normalize, why it is you do that you do, or why it is that you do what you do, or that you feel the way that you feel. And the other thing that's really important here is that, what we're talking about here today is really under the hood stuff. This isn't observable, right? So, it's very difficult to have an accurate sort of measurement of why or how your motivation would be impacting you. And so that's really what we're doing with the idea. We are psychometrically measuring you against other people to give you an idea of how important or how much emphasis are you placing on a particular motivation versus others. And then again, you may have normalized the extent to this. And, I have a quick story about this where I had a really good friend growing up who was scored very high in the motivation of excelling. And excelling is about, being very achievement oriented, being very driven, sort of having a never good enough mindset, waking up in the morning and not having any issue, getting out of bed and getting to work and working hard. And he had just moved into leadership, and it was for the first time was leading people. And he was into it about 6 months or so. And he calls me up and he says, I got to tell you, I'm really confused by people. And I said, what do you mean? And he says, well, I'm finding that so much of my leadership is about motivating people, and I just don't get it. Why are people not showing up at 6 a.m. every day to do their job? And again, that's what had happened for him. When you have an extreme score, in this case, an extreme motivation and achievement, he normalized it. Isn't everybody this way? Doesn't everybody wake up in the morning and feel the way that I feel? Well, no, they don't. And again, it can be hard to recognize this. And then the other thing here about motivation that is tricky is that it can conflict with itself, right? Motivation can often lead to a place where individuals have mixed feelings about how they're feeling, what it is that they should do, why it is that they're doing what they're doing. And very often a singular motivation or competing motivations will make a person feel really pushed in one direction and pulled in another, right? And it will create really a sense of agitation potentially within an individual. So I think it's really important to recognize that very often motivations, they don't reinforce, they can reinforce, but very often they sort of come in conflict with one another to create feelings that they're difficult to grapple with in some ways. Okay, so I want to move into the motivational predisposition side of things, but before I do that, I just want to get some definitions out of the way. So first things first, predispose. Predispose is to give an inclination or a tendency beforehand, or to make susceptible, right? So John has a predisposition to exaggerate, right? So you are set up to potentially do something or have a predisposition to something. And when you take this predisposition and apply it to the motivational sense, what we really mean by this is how your motivational profile and motivational makeup can lead you to have a tendency to do things a particular way, right? To react to things in a particular way. And I think it's really important to remember that, your motivational makeup is a huge driving force in terms of in terms of why you do what you do. And it's important to recognize that your motivational makeup moves you down a path of doing things the way that you do them without even giving consideration for potentially thinking about it in a different way, reacting in a different way. And this is really what we're talking about here today in terms of self-regulation. You know, if you don't have anything in place to have some awareness about how your motivation is taking you somewhere, you're going to end up in the same place again and again and again. And that's really what we're talking about here today in terms of combining motivation and self-regulation. So, you know, the IDI, as I mentioned here at the forefront of the webinar, you know, the IDI as a tool allows us to get an understanding or provide some awareness about what an individual is attracted toward and what are they moving away from. And again, it really gives us some insight into what is a person's motivational inclination and predispositions. And at the end of the day, the IDI is a tool that can be used to create some awareness about some things that people might not have a lot of awareness about. So what questions does a motivational predisposition answer, right? If you have some insight or some awareness about what your motivational predispositions are, excuse me, what kind of questions do they answer? Well, it answers the questions of, you know, why do I think the way that I think? Why do I make some of the decisions that I make? Why do I behave the way that I behave? And I think my personal favorite, why do I feel the way that I feel, right? And what is your awareness around these motivations and how they impact you? I will tell you, I think about my own IDI profile just about every day. And I know my IDI profile very, very well, probably too well. But the reason why I think about it and why I love it so much is because it allows me to answer these questions. And having some answers to these questions is pretty impactful, right? And so, it helps me talk to myself in the healthiest of ways about why I think the way that I think, and why I feel the way that I feel, and it allows me to move through life with a little bit more awareness, and potentially break some patterns that, before I knew my motivational predispositions, that I sort of always ended up in. So I want to give some examples to crystallize, what I mean by a motivational predispositions, and how it can impact a person on both the positive side and also the negative side, right? So if you have an extreme motivation on one thing or a lack of a motivation somewhere else, those have they impact you in particular ways, both on the positive and the negative. So if someone is really motivated to provide comfort and support, right? They would be motivated to be very caring toward others, to have a degree of empathy, to potentially put somebody else's needs in front of their own, but really they're motivated to provide comfort and support. This can do a few things for them. On the positive side, it can lead to a person feeling really, or a person being very helpful, potentially being quite protective of others, and also very sensitive to other people's needs, being in tune to other people's needs, maybe even being oversensitive to other people's needs. Because again, motivated to provide that comfort and support, and to provide that comfort and support, they need to be sensitive to other people. We'll potentially turn that into some degree of helpfulness, and that is a sort of a positive thing about this motivation. On the other side, there can be an inability to say no, right? So if you have again a strong motivation here, your inclination or the path that you go down is, yes, I can help you, or yes, you definitely need my support, and so I will be there. And very often the flip of that is an inability to say no, an inability to recognize what it means to say yes, actually. You know, how much effort will it mean? What am I committing myself to if I say yes when somebody asks for help? And again, that inclination, the path that this motivation takes you down is to say yes, and to say yes without thinking about what the ramifications are. And so very often people with a strong motivation here can end up with a lot on their plate, right? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this motivation when I talk about a sort of a self-reinforcing pattern here in a few minutes. It's another one here. Another motivation here would be motivation to gain recognition and respect. So somebody who has a strong motivation here is a person who does a lot of things to attract positive attention to themselves in the form of recognition and respect, right? So they like to be recognized for their efforts. They would like to be respected in one way or another. It might be pretty specific about what they want the respect for or who they want it from, but in some way they are motivated to have some recognition and respect. One of the most, I would say, positive outcomes from this motivation is having a degree of social awareness. Because again, when you think about this, and if an individual is motivated to have some recognition or respect, at the end of the day, you know, they really want people thinking about them in particular ways, right? I want you thinking about me in this way. And if you want somebody thinking about you in a particular way, it means you probably need to have an understanding of, you know, how they are reacting to you, right? And so you need some feelers out there to understand how a person is reacting to you. Oh, they liked this, they didn't like this. And so they did like this, so I'm going to do a little bit more of that, right? And so what comes with this motivation is this degree of social awareness and social adeptness that allows a person to really gain an understanding of what their impact is on other people, and it allows them to get to a place where they really want people thinking about them in particular ways, and so they will behave accordingly and make decisions accordingly as well. And that leads into the sort of the negative side of this in terms of feeling forced or not making decisions for themselves. Because again, if you are doing something because you want somebody thinking about you in particular ways, you might not actually be doing the thing that you really want to do at the end of the day, right? So you walk into a situation and you want to make this decision, or you want to behave that way, but you recognize that, well, maybe my reputation is a little bit at stake, or I really think that this person wants me to do this, or that person wants me to do that. Then you might feel a little bit forced about the decision that you make and the corresponding behavior. And so you might not feel like you are, making a decision for yourself. Instead, you're almost making a decision for the other person and what you want the other person thinking about you. That's another one here. How about being less motivated to be persistent and tenacious? So, the first two there was, you having extreme motivation on the high side. Let's on the lower side, right? So having less of a motivation to be really strong-willed, to be really tenacious, to be be very willing to sort of slog it out, right? And to be motivated by things being difficult, actually, or being less motivated by things being difficult. Excuse me. When things get hard, a person who's less motivated here might say, I don't really want to do this anymore. So on the positive side here, what can happen with being less motivated is, a degree of flexibility, a degree of trying alternatives. Because again, when things get a little bit difficult, a person who's less motivated here is probably going to be quicker to recognize when something isn't working, right? Well, this behavior or this decision or this pattern of whatever it is not working. And so it is, they might be quicker to recognize it and quicker to try an alternative. Secondly, they might be a little bit more easygoing, with their relationships and how they move about life. It's I'm fine with that. I don't have a huge need to sort of, force myself or be really sort of tenacious in how we're doing about it. And if you want to do it that way, I'm fine with it. On the downside, person might be get bored a little bit easy, right? Or maybe give up too easily, right? So, I mean, in terms of trying alternatives, there's a fine line between, maybe being too quick to recognize when something isn't working and trying alternatives versus just versus if you had given a little bit more effort, you would have gotten there already. So giving up too easily potentially is a downside of being less persistent and tenacious. And in terms of being bored, well, I'm going to use myself as an example here. And what can happen is you can get distracted. So I am an individual who I'm at the bottom of the barrel when it comes to this motivation. If there's one that I wish that I could change, I think it would be this one, but it is what it is. And very often I will call myself a sort of an 85%er or a 90%er. And what I mean by that is, when I'm engaged in a project or a task or whatever it might be, I very often, get it to a spot where it's about 85% of the way done. And of course, I've left the 15% that I've left is the 15% that I don't really want to do. But at 85%, it's okay. It's functional. It works. And at that point, not only do I not have the motivation to sort of get through that last 10 or 15%, but I also get attracted by something new, right? I get a little bored about the thing that I've been engaged with, and then something else, shiny pops up, and I want to head over and start doing that. So at the end of the day, I'm almost more attracted by the newness of things or the beginnings of things versus the end. So it's sort of an example here of less motivated to be persistent and tenacious. All right, one more here. So motivated to be by self-sufficiency and self-reliance. So really motivated to do things on your own, right? To have a degree of freedom. And so if you are motivated or have a strong motivation here, a person will really seek freedom because they are motivated to do things the way that they want to do them. And it is likely that they will find a lot of joy in doing things exactly the way that they want to sort of customizing something the way that they want to. And really feeling like they, put their stamp on it, right? And that they were the reason, the thing ended up the way that it ended up. And they find joy in, again, building that world that they want. At the same time, what's difficult about this is, you don't live in a world where it's only you, right? You live in a world where, there are other people, other things to deal with, multiple relationships. And so very often, this comes with the fact that you have to, fight a little bit of restriction. When I say restriction, I mean the restrictions that come with potentially having a boss, potentially being in relationship with, with individuals. And so a person with this motivation can often have conflicting desires about, well, I want to do this alone, but I also recognize that there's a lot of other competing forces in the world that I have to sort of deal with. And so it's a balancing act of wanting to do it myself, but then also realizing that you really can't at some level because there are, again, other forces. So what I just want to point out here is that, when we have extreme scores or extreme motivations on one side or the other, what often can come with it are some biases, right? And again, this comes back to the the normalizing effect in some way, right? Where it's difficult to understand how these motivations can impact you. So I don't have time to go through all of these, but I'll just pick a couple just to highlight. And I mentioned excelling earlier and that never good enough mindset. Just to what can happen with this mindset is really never taking a moment to pause. Never taking a moment to recognize the achievement that has occurred, right? Very often people with an excelling, with an extreme excelling score, the only achievement that is important to them is the one that has yet to be completed. And so there's very little time to celebrate the victories, and they might not even recognize that they have happened. Right? They walk around, their world where you just feel as if you're not doing enough and it's not good enough. So it can be a tough place to be in. I mean, it can be extremely motivating, right? Of course, can push a person through their life. At the same time, it also can be, a difficult mindset. And then, I just want to, I was just talking about, being really self-reliant, and that's the IDI dimension of independence. So I'm down at interpretive biases here. So a great example here of an interpretive bias is how a person with a high independence score, that that really liking to do things on their own, what happens when somebody offers their help or offers assistance? Person with a high independence score very often doesn't interpret it as help or support. They interpret it as interference, right? They say, well, I really want to do this on my own, and I really don't need your help. And actually, your help is interfering with my process, and it feels like you're trying to take it over. And so very often a person with high independence will do one of two things. The first will be they'll fight it. They will say, no, please get out of here. Or will just lose the motivation to do it entirely, because again, they wanted to do it on their own. And when somebody offered their help and sort of injected the way that they want to do it, they just say, you know what, I'm out here. You sort of do it, and I'm going to go do something else. So this is just a list of some biases that come with these motivations, but it's again another really important aspect of motivational predispositions. The last thing I want to talk about here before I hand it over to David is how do we potentially sometimes get ourselves in trouble? And David is really going to talk about how we can potentially put some things into place to recognize and break these self-reinforcing patterns. But I want to let you know what we mean when I say a self-reinforcing pattern. And what this all comes down to, and is important to recognize, is that our thoughts, our behaviors, and our emotions are all connected, right? And they often reinforce one another and reinforce the story that you are telling yourself, right? So you have your thoughts impact your behaviors impact your emotions, and your emotions impact your thoughts, and so on and so forth. And if you have nothing in place to break how these things might be reinforcing one another, very often you can end up in the same place that you always end up. And again, it's important to remember that the IDI doesn't tell us how we're behaving, but it gives you insight on what your motivational predispositions are, potentially what these patterns might be. Again, it talks to you about what your thoughts might be and what your emotions might be. And so therefore, it has huge ramifications or implications for what your behaviors might be. So the IDI is a really great tool to understand and build some awareness about some of the things that I'm talking about here. So let's just give a couple of examples to crystallize what I mean when I say a self-reinforcing pattern. Earlier, I was referencing high giving, which is support and really feeling motivated by supporting others. And what can happen here in terms of the thoughts is I have a responsibility to care for people, and that people value that support. What can happen with sort of dissonant emotions or emotions that are sort of come in conflict with one another, potentially the motivation isn't being satisfied, or you're doing something that doesn't support the motivation. What happens here is, when you're doing something that does support the motivation, you feel valuable when you're helping, but then you also feel selfish when you're not. It also can lead to a place of resentment, right? I'm motivated to help and support other people, but boy, I always feel like I'm supporting and helping other people. And when do I get to think about me? And that is one of the biggest sort of problems with a high giving score, high giving motivation is, you and your own priorities never get addressed. And then what happens to you in terms of attributions? This is the sort of the fundamental attribution error in terms of how you would feel about other people if you feel like they don't have this motivation or they aren't doing this. You might think that a person is really unhelpful. They're selfish or emotionally distant. And so you can start to, because you have this motivation, you can start to actually make inaccurate assumptions or attributions about people, even though, they might also have a strong motivation here, but they might not be behaving in that particular way. So again, this is a indication of how these things are under the hood and not observable. And again, the behaviors here, so prioritizing others' needs over your own, as what I was just saying, where your priorities always end up at the bottom of the barrel because you always say yes and you put too much on your plate, and then potentially you're viewed as a resource or useful to have around. And then again, self-regulation. If you don't have anything into place to stop this self-reinforcing pattern, you're going to end up at the same place again and again and again. And again, awareness is the sort of the key to stopping this. Structuring is the second one I want to do here, just very quickly before I hand it over to David. First, with high structuring, this is about being motivated to be very detailed, very meticulous, really wanting to organize things and to have a degree of efficiency. And with this, very often what comes with a high structuring motivation, the thought is there's a way of doing it and there's a way of not doing it. And I want to be doing it the way that we should be doing it. There's a right way and there's a wrong way, and let's be doing it the right way. In terms of the dissonant emotions, if the motivation isn't satisfied, or you would be doing something that would be maybe you would feel is messy, you feel very frustrated or potentially mistrustful of yourself or maybe even other people. And then if you recognize in terms of the attributions, if somebody's out there and you feel as if they are approaching something without a plan, without a degree of detail or organization, you might think that person in general is sloppy or disinterested or inconsistent. And therefore you might not really trust them to do what it is that you want them to do. And then what ends up happening is, we were working on that together, but I'm going to take it back because I just don't trust you at the end of the day. I'll do it myself, or I will supervise you very, very closely as you are doing it, because again, I don't trust you. So I think the other thing, I've gone through 2 of these. There are 15 others in terms of the IDI, and you actually could say there are even more than that, because this happens on the high side and then also the low side. So these patterns. There's a lot of them in terms of understanding what they might mean for individuals. All right, so questions, Lucy? Anything before we hand it over to David?
One quick one, Drew, about the motivational predispositions. Could you speak a little bit to high stability and how that might influence in some of these predispositions, particularly when external factors, outside world factors, are highly unstable?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I think sort of relevant to right now. Somebody who would be really motivated by stability in the current world circumstance would be even more agitated or uncomfortable than potentially than they would in sort of a more predictable or consistent world, right? So in terms of that motivational predisposition on the high stability side, person, it really would work very, very hard to ensure that they understand what's coming at them. And in the current world circumstance, we don't know what's coming in the next 48 hours. So person, I would say 2 things is they might feel more uncomfortable than somebody who has a lower score here or a lower motivation. And they also might be working extra hard to try and regain some semblance of control or some semblance of understanding of what's coming at them than somebody who would have a weaker motivation.
Thanks, Drew. In the interest of time, let's go ahead and turn things over to David. But folks, if you have any further questions, we welcome them certainly. And if we can't get to them during the broadcast, we'll get to them afterwards. So please do just pop any questions or clarifications you need in that Q&A box. Thanks. David, do we have you?
Yeah, you got me now. My PC decided not to cooperate.
Oh dear.
Technology and I are never the best of friends on a good day, and this is not a good day. Not based on the Irish weather. Before we get into the next, the kind of the closing section of this, and talk about some of the solutions and some of the patterns, let's remind ourselves, when we measure motivation, it's descriptive. There are probably over 100 people on this webinar, and for any of you, I can assure you, what motivates me is not the same as what motivates you. That does not make me better than you. It does not make me worse than you. It makes me different than you. And every single one of you, living and breathing as we speak, are unique. So people may think that they know you, but they only think that they know you. Only you live in that skin of yours. Only you walk your path. Only you breathe your air. And it's a very private, it's a very personal, it's a complex little place. It can get noisy in here sometimes. And it's really helpful to understand our own nature, our own characteristic, this motivational DNA, because to Drew's point, we normalize our own condition, and we often normalize our own condition to the point we don't even see it anymore. And we walk in the room with assumptions and mindsets and expectations and ways of interpreting things, and we don't even know we're doing it. So there's a real moment of clarity sometimes when we get the feedback. And to understand where we are motivationally compared to others is a great gift, because it's very hard for us to be objective, to Drew's point, when the only thing you can observe about other people are their behaviors. So to have an understanding and insight around where we are motivationally, it begins to explain a great deal. That relationship about why I think in certain ways, why I feel in certain ways, why gravity pulls me towards certain types of behaviors and behavioral patterns, and why I have to find energy to engage in other things that I'm intellectually capable of, but there's just very little in it for me. That's a really powerful level of insight, which is why the individual directions inventory, or IDI, is such a powerful coaching tool. A very practical example, just building on the giving, the predisposition to want to help, that emotional sense of responsibility to care, the thoughts and beliefs that it doesn't necessarily follow, but we have to ask ourselves the question, does it become part of my identity? The purpose I am here is to do things in service of other people. The thing about that, if the behavior follows, people kind of get used to it. Then people begin to take it for granted. Then people begin to expect it. And as much as you might find it enjoyable and energizing in and of itself, the consequences can create dissonance. I enjoy helping you, but I'm kind of tired of being used. And I'm kind of angry at myself because I'm the one who's continually invited. And why do I keep doing all of that? So when I do it, I feel good, but part of me resents it. If I pull back, I know I'm looking after me, but this is dissatisfying. Now I'm feeling selfish, that whole thing. The more we put other people first, the risk is we might put ourselves second. We may not even realize we're doing it. It can be remarkably self-deprecating. You know, that scenario where we try to help people, they get used to it, we begin to resent them, we try to pull back, and then because they've gotten used to it and they expect it and they take it for granted, and then we suddenly stop doing it, suddenly you're the bad guy. How does that work? It kind of proves what they say about the road to hell and good intentions. So the extent to which we have some degree of personal insight into where we are and where gravity pulls us in any of these drivers is important, because one of the fundamental principles in psychology is that you cannot control what you don't understand. The first thing we lose when we get into a reactive cycle is we lose any sense of perspective. And I can only speak for myself for the reasons I mentioned earlier. I'm not any of you. But if I look back at the number of times I got things out of proportion, I made things bigger than they were. I made a storm out of a teacup. That, you know, there's a million cliches out there. Probably 8 times out of 10, that's what I do. You want to keep doing that? So knowing these predispositions, now we can see them coming. Now we can observe ourselves in a way that we might not otherwise, because once you're in the reaction, it's a little bit too late. It's the moment of lucidity between the stimulus and the reaction is what I'm getting at here. The cycles of reaction I'm going to touch on, and the extent to which we are driven and have these natural innate predispositions We may not realize it because we normalize our own condition. Where do we start? Well, there's a few places. The first is, I think, to understand how we react. Some people react in a way which is very strong, very emotional, but it comes and goes quite quickly, particularly if there's a rational part of them and that kicks in. The rational part says, okay, cool it down, think this through, be more objective, look at the evidence, and let's begin to organize our thinking. If that is part of your disposition, that's probably going to help you to flatten the curve sooner or later. If there is a part of you that has an emotional piece, then the emotional piece can take over. And those who know the neuropsychology of the brain will understand how those different parts of the brain work and how they can flip between one and the other. So some people will have a natural, strong reaction. Some people, the reaction takes longer. We react to something, it may not be as dramatic, but we spend a long time licking our wounds. We hold on. So the theme of letting go can be a thing around this one. I don't know where any of you are on this. I'm not sure I spend 5 days a week sitting down and thinking about where I am. But once in a while, it may be worth stopping and reflecting on these things, because then you begin to recognize it. And there are ways of getting to these types of insights, which I'm going to touch on. Before I do that, I want to talk about this. When we think about the amount of anxiety and stress and such like that we experience living in the skin of ours, how much of it comes from within and how much of it is a percentage of a realistic measure of the world around us? So what percentage of our stress is self-inflicted?
Thanks, David. I'll give folks a minute to just weigh in, being as honest with yourself as you can, which is always a challenge, as we know. Give everyone just another moment or two. All right. See those results. All right, so 10% feel like it's more than 90%, 42% the majority are in that 75 to 90 range, 32% of us are in the 50 to 75% range, and 16% feel like it's less than half.
Okay, so if my numbers are correct, more than half of our reactions, in fact, 84%, those are your numbers, I'm not making them up, indicates most of what we do to ourselves. And in fact, the majority is in the 42%, the 75 to 90, which does indicate that a lot of what we do is self-inflicted. Do you want to keep doing that? You want to spend the rest of your life bouncing off the four walls, making yourself twice as tired, twice as vulnerable, and waking up the next day with exactly the same problem? And often that is the moment of clarity. It begins to reinforce our commitment to ourselves, because there are ways out of this. It does indicate that a lot of what's going on lies within us. And the more we can invest in our ability to observe ourselves objectively, lucidly, completely, the more it's going to have a substantial increase, because a lot of this is within us. So the questions, are there times I react out of proportion? I gotta tell you, most of my life as I think about this, the times I didn't were probably fewer than the times I did. And that alone increases my ability to say, listen, David, have a word with yourself. Any chance you've gotten it wrong? Any chance that when you look back at similar scenarios, that you got the wrong end of the stick? Is there the vaguest possibility I'm doing it again? Because I'll keep doing it. And that alone is remarkably liberating. To be more objective. I'm not dismissing emotions. Emotions are a very rich and a very necessary thing, but there are disadvantages to them. Emotions can breed a stronger type of reaction, the reaction that may in fact be slightly out of proportion. So we have to ask ourselves the question, Are my predispositions possibly feeding into the way I think, the way I feel? And are these predispositions actually helpful for me? Let's not rely on the assumption that because you find something rewarding, fulfilling, and satisfying, that it's all good. These drivers often serve themselves. This disposition, for example, of independence, satisfaction for being self-reliant, self-sufficient, doing your own thing, your own way, on your own terms, but the potential interpretive bias it brings, the interpretation of support from other people as interference. Leave me alone. Let me get on with it. Don't go away mad. Just go away. Are any of us so bulletproof that we don't need a leg up once in a while? If you have this disposition, is there any chance that you may be reluctant to put your hand up and ask for support, even when you know that you need it? Because there's part of it would interfere with your need to be self-reliant. Is there a chance that this might increase the likelihood that if someone offers you support, even if you didn't ask for it, you might arbitrarily reject it, even if help would be good for you? And I could give you many other examples. There are better ways of understanding the cycles of reaction so that we can begin to understand what gets through to us. So understanding what triggers the reactions. It's not arbitrary. It's not random. There are reasons why any of us react in certain ways. There are things that we are sensitive to. There are things that we are susceptible to. And it may be very unique to the individual. And the motivational DNA often provides some very significant clues to that, which of course it's very hard for us to have any insight into because we're too busy living in the skin of ours. So the never good enough, the excelling driver, my desire for bigger, for better, for more. I get there. That's not good enough. I want this. You get there. That's not good enough. I want that. It's never good enough. It is relentless. Never happy where I am because it's not where I want to be. But even if I get there, it's not good enough anyway. So what is the point? And it can be remarkably self-deprecating and self-punishing and strangely rewarding. Does that always serve me well? Is there a time where I need to know where enough is enough? Great skill in life. The thing about my desire to help other people, can be self-deprecating. At what point do I value myself? At what point do I put my own needs ahead of other people without feeling guilty about it? The people with high on giving often have an assumption bias. They may assume for no reason that other people want their support. And where is that written? The predictability, stability driver. Some people don't like surprises. They're cautious. They like to know what's around the corner. And it leads us into these cycles of fear and trepidation and negative anticipation, and they grow their own legs, in which case you're a passenger. These drivers have taken over a little bit. And if we don't understand that, I think it's harder to self-observe and to win back that locus of control. So there's a particular really comes from clinical practice, 3 questions to begin to ask yourselves about assessing and evaluating that whole reactive space. Number 1, what am I most sensitive to? Have we ever stopped and asked the question? Is it uncertainty? Am I sensitive to feeling unsupported? Am I sensitive to feeling excluded? We're being specific here. That granularity is important. There's a difference between feeling unsupported and feeling excluded. There's all sorts of different things, and these are just arbitrary examples I'm giving now. But each of you will have your unique sensitivities in unique proportions. If you're not in touch with them and you have very little insight into them, it's harder to begin to control them or to observe them objectively. Because this will influence the sensitivities and the stories that we tell and the self-reinforcing patterns we get ourselves into. So step 1, what are the sensitivities to begin with? Number 2 is how do I react to those sensitivities? Again, our reactions can be very unique and they can be very observable. You get the somatic effects of physical tension, lack of sleep and such like that. It's not random. There are indicators. Hold on a second, I'm feeling this way. There are reasons for that. There may be certain times of the week. There may be certain stimulus that give rise to these reactions because they're triggering a sensitivity. Keeping a journal can be very helpful because over time you see it's always that Sunday evening thing. It's not random. It's always when someone says this to me and I take it personally, the criticism. Maybe it's the gaining stature. I'm sensitive to what people think about me, and so on. So logging this and noting it really increases our ability to observe and to find out what's going on in fact. And the final one is what helps me to dissipate these effects as quickly as possible. You know, some people do this thing. I talk to myself a week from today. It sounds crazy, but it works because that version of David a week from now is the other side of the reaction. That version of me tends to be pretty critical, by the way. He says, David, you're a complete idiot. What were you worried about? You did it again. You got things out of proportion. You worried either out of proportion to what was going on, or you worried about things which didn't even exist, in which case you had a whole new problem, a reaction to nothing. And I spent a fair bit of my adult life doing that. Doesn't need to happen. It's easier said than done, but there are opportunities here. The rationalization thing is a very good approach because sometimes we can help to organize our thinking, let's think objectively, but if we're too far down the road, all of us, I'm sure, have had bad old days or a bad old week or a period of time which gets a bit dark. And the rationalization just doesn't work. In which case, that whole thing where you step away from the reaction and try to distract yourself with something which A, is sufficiently immersive, and B, sufficiently enjoyable, that when you come back out of that, you're able to win back the perspective, look at yourself and say, okay, what was I worried about? What was I thinking? That can take time. That's often about chipping away at this habits that we've gotten into. It can be about unlearning the cycles. So it's not about development per se. And it does help us when we develop that internal narrative to look back at what history has taught you, if we're willing to do so. Look at the lifeline. How much of my life, as I've gone from birth up to has been driven or shaped by these motivational factors? And often, in hindsight, we begin to recognize it. Excelling, how much of my life has spent pushing myself for bigger, for better, for more, but living with that never good enough thing? I'm exhausted by it. How about other factors like gaining stature? I've lived my whole life based on other people's expectations of me. That approval-seeking part of me is kind of wearing me down a little bit. I live my life according to what I think other people expect of me. Do you want to keep doing that? The stability, I'm cautious, I don't like surprises, I like to see what's around the corner, but I spent my life sticking to the safe bet. And if that's what you want, great, at least then it's a choice and you understand the consequences, the upsides, the advantages. But if we've never had that conversation with ourselves, then, like I said, the driver is controlling us much more than we're controlling it. And the final section is this. The drivers, we can see beyond them. Please do not assume that this is fatalistic, that these are my drivers, these are the cards I've been dealt, there's nothing I can do about it. That's not true at all. When we step back and we simply understand them and how they influence us, but then we look at overarching things. What is important in my life? And people would say my career is important, my family is important, my health is important, and so on. And we got to ask the question, a question I've touched on earlier. Do my motivational drivers serve me well? Because in many cases, they will. They will contribute positively to the achievement of things that are personally important to you in overarching terms. But there may be drivers that do not. There may be tensions between drivers that create these mixed feelings that makes it harder to self-regulate. Or there may be times when we just simply need to manage the disadvantages that necessarily come with drivers that otherwise we would not want to change. So what we're aiming for, to summarize, is that objective self-observation, our ability to observe ourselves more completely, more objectively in every sense of the term. The development of internal narrative is remarkably powerful, remarkably liberating. We win back the first thing we lose when the reaction takes over. We get things out of proportion, we lose perspective. And ultimately, this is a very powerful investment in yourself. From myself and Drew and the rest of the MRG team that we represent, we thank you. It's been a great privilege to spend some time with you today. I hope you enjoyed it, and feel free to ask any questions. So I'm going to hand it back to Lucy to wrap up. Lucy.
Thanks so much, David, and thanks, Drew. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. A reminder that you will get the recording and the slide deck, so look out for those in your inbox. We won't have any time to take any more questions on the broadcast today, but you can still pop those right into the Q&A, or you can email us anytime, research@mrg.com. If anything comes to you later, you're welcome to share that. We have some great things coming up, including a tool talk, which is new. Discover the IDI. You can join us for just a free, fast-paced half hour where we're going to go into this tool. We had a few great questions about the IDI. If it's one you don't know very well, definitely join us for that. It's a great kind of crash course in what that assessment's all about. We, of course, have certifications in the IDI and personal directions coming up. More webinars, a great workshop. If you are certified in the IDI, join us for that. You can find all of those on mrg.com under the calendar tab. So please go ahead and register for all of that, because we certainly look forward to seeing you again very soon. With that, I will let you all go, but please stay in touch, and thank you for joining us. We'll see you again soon.